Hey, 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 welcome back to, I was going to say another episode of Faith Sage, but I guess that's not necessarily what it is. Anyway, it's been a long day. It's been a long night. Thank you so much for tuning in again, wherever you are. Um, if you are tuning in live to this presentation, please comment in the comment section where you're tuning in from. I would love to know because, like, I'm in the middle of Minnesota here, and it's 1 o'clock my time in the morning, and I would just be kind of cool to see who's all here, who's all hanging out with me. Today, I want to talk about how to turn your grief into a book, or I should say, turning your grief into a book. So, while I cannot go into all the nuances of a book, what it entails, how to do it, all those things, because it's a very in-depth process. It's very robust. Um, but what I will do is I'll tell you why a book is an amazing thing, why it's good for you to write down your grief, why it's good to put that on paper. I will also tell you what is involved with a book, like what's kind of like some of the processes, what to look forward to, what to watch out for, and then how to get started. So, because that's always a big thing is like, how do you get started with a book? And so I will walk you back to, like I've talked about this weekend. I've been on a few times. I've talked about um, my 7 ways to find solid ground in the midst of a loss. I've talked about a little bit of my journey on losing my daughter and my granddaughter. I've also talked about that I'm also a business owner. I'm an entrepreneur. So I hire business coaches to help me get to the next level in business, to keep growing, to keep doing, to keep being. And so last year, before my granddaughter passed, I had hired a business coach. And I had mentioned last night as well that I build sales funnels, I build landing pages, I do graphics, I do copywriting, I do these things. And I wanted to scale my business that I had at that time. I wanted to scale it. So I hired a coach, an amazing business coach, number one, in like a lot of different areas for like helping you scale your business. And no fluff, no BS, no, none of that stuff. He just straight up help you get your shit done, right? And so I hired him to help me build my sales funnel business. And about a month into the process, I lose my granddaughter. And at that point, I wanted to switch my focus and go straight into grief. Like I knew that this is where I wanted to go. In 2016, I had lost my daughter, my stepdaughter, and I had already started in my mind. I'd already started transitioning that process from where I was to heading to grief. But I decided to. I was scared. It was almost like I felt like I didn't have enough. Like I wasn't qualified to be talking about grief. I wasn't qualified to help anyone through the grief process. I wasn't qualified to do any of these things. And so I wrote out a course. I had it all written down, had it all fleshed out with what would be in each one. They were all titles, they were all everything. It was all set. The only thing I had to do was literally sit down and record the uh, the audios for them. And I didn't do it. I just put it on the back burner. So last year when I lost my granddaughter, I told my business coach, I said, I know where I want to head. I I know exactly the path that I want to go down. I had pulled back from it in 2016 when I lost my daughter, but I thought, you know what? It's 2021. I just lost my granddaughter. This process feels like 2.0. Like I've been here before. I've done this before. It feels familiar to me, even though it sounds really freaking sad. Like, it feels familiar to me. I know the steps, I know the processes, I know what to do, I know how to help people, I know how to help my child, plan their child's funeral. Like, I know these steps, or at least what they would be feeling. Like, I had not lost a grandchild before, but I knew the emotions that they'd be going through. I knew all of the stuff that was gonna happen, like, almost to a T. You know, there'd be variations because this is their grief process and how they move from one section of the grief to the next section, to the next section, to the next section would all be different. And there'd be some they would last longer in, some they would move quicker through, and then they would come back. You know, it's a ping pong game at that point. When you go through the grief, you feel like you're on a ping pong table, like you're just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But I knew this. And so I told my business coach, I want to head to grief. I want to help people with grief. I want to do it. And his words were, Faith, you need to write a book. You have to write your story. You have to put it on paper. Otherwise, what's the point? Like this is your starting point in your business is your book. And so I wrote my first book, A Walk with Faith, Surviving the Death of a Child. I can tell you that this book itself, like, even if nobody ever read it, and I've sold a few, I haven't sold a ton, and that wasn't the purpose of the book. The purpose was getting the book written. The purpose was putting my story on paper. The purpose was going to, help me with my grieving process because, you know, when you're in the middle of grief, like and even me, like in 2016, we went through the process of grief. Like we took steps. We made sure that we were helping ourselves. We made sure that we were taking care of ourselves, my husband and I, and watching out for our children and stuff like that. But when we lost our granddaughter, it was different. It was a different type of grief, if that makes sense. It was a different emotional impact on that grief because now I'm watching my child go through the grief as well as myself processing it as well, and my husband, and all these different factors and variables that I'm now seeing and witnessing. So while it did feel familiar from 2016 version to the 2021 version, it was still different, vastly different. And so as I was writing the book, as I was writing the book, all these emotions kept coming out, like emotions I didn't think that I had buried. I thought that I had processed everything. But the funny thing with grief is it'll come back, it'll leave, you'll go into a different section of it, you'll go into another section of it, and you'll meander, and you'll just keep going meandering through all of these different sections of grief. And so I realized as when I was writing that book that I still had grief that I hadn't talked about. I still had grief that I hadn't emotionally released. And writing this book helped me emotionally release this grief. And so I got the process down so well, I went ahead and I published a second book. So now I had two books published to my name. And it helped with the grieving process a little bit more and a little bit more. And I also have books 3 and 4. They're in the works. They're not quite done. I have a few chapters left to finish on them and then put them into the publishing stage. And then I'll have, you know, more books done. And it's not to sit here and brag that I'm writing all these books. Are there mistakes in them? Absolutely. Are they polished and poised? Absolutely not. I don't, that's not me. I'm very real. I'm very raw. I'm very, I don't want to say, you know, like I'm approachable. And that's how I want to be. And so tonight I want to talk to you about turning your grief into a book, helping you with that process as well, because it'll take your grieving to a whole nother level. It'll take your grieving and help you like just massively get this weight that's on you. It'll lift it. It'll almost like break through for you. So, but why a book? Well, for me, like I just stated, it helps with the grieving process. It number 1, bar none, helped me with my grieving process. I could listen to a billion and one NDEs or go see a ton of psychologists or whatever, but actually physically remembering the stories, remembering the events that led up to when I lost my daughter, when I lost my granddaughter, and I talked about the loss of my father as well, who was a major influence in my life. Talking about the events that led up to those events, to losing these loved ones in my life that were my world, that is your story. That is where you get to craft your story. You get to tell somebody your version of how you felt, what you went through, the thoughts in your head, even down to what you were wearing, because a lot of people remember like boom, 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 a lot of things about their grieving, about their not their grieving, but about the story leading up to the event where they lost their loved one. It is absolutely amazing that you can remember that much detail. It so specifically in a moment in time, it just fascinates me. So, one of the ways is to help you with the grieving process. It's also a tribute to your loved one. So, what better way to show your loved one that you love them than by writing them in a book, by writing about them, by telling stories about them, funny stories about them, sad stories about them, times about this, times about that, vacations, injuries that they sustain, like if it's a child, like riding their bike and falling down, or going to the ER visit because they broke their arm or whatever the case may be. There's tons of stories that you can put in there. You can talk about them, your emotions, the love that you feel for them, the how scared you are for them as they're growing older and reaching this amazing young adult that you have put blood, sweat, and tears into. Like you get to put all of this into your book. And it's also a legacy for your future generations. So, your future generations, so my grandkids and great grandkids and great great grandkids will be able to pick up this book and they'll be able to read. Like, this one's about my childhood. They'll be able to read about my childhood because how often do you actually talk about your childhood? How often do you sit there and tell stories of your childhood? Usually, we don't tell stories of our childhood until we're like advanced in age. And at that time, if you haven't already built those connections and those bonds with your children and grandchildren and great grandchildren, they may not sit down to listen to them. And then once you're gone, so are your stories. So is your childhood. So are the things that mattered to you in this world. They're all gone. They die with you. So a book is a great way to get those stories on paper and to share them with your future generations. This book here talks about my journey of losing my father, my daughter, and my granddaughter. It talks about my feelings, it talks about my emotions. It talks about the process with which I went through, the heartache, the heartbreak, you know, making sure that our other children were okay, all of those things. You put that on the paper and then your future generations can read, what you went through with that as well. But what is involved with it? How do you take the thoughts from your head and put them on paper? Like, what does that entail? What is a book? So, what's involved with the book? You have like three basic sections. You have what's called the front matter, the middle portion, and then the back matter. Okay. The middle portion, that's super simple. That's just the writing. That's all your stories. That's all your chapters. That's that's the meat of the book. The two other portions, the front matter and the back matter, or the front matter and the back, whichever one I had. I don't know. Those two portions I call the bookends. So those two portions on the front matter, you have your copyright information, you have your dedication, you have your introduction, your prologue, you have everything leading up to starting the story. So like if you have someone that's going to um not narrate your book, but I want to call it an endorsement, but it's similar to an endorsement because it depends upon what your book is for as well. So mine is a personal book. It's in the memoir section. It's in the it's not a business book. I didn't write it as a business book. I do talk about business in there, but it is not, I did not write it with business in mind. I wrote it as a memoir style. So these are just my stories, a collection of stories that I wrote of memories that I had with my loved ones. So the front section is just all about leading up to where you're going to start talking about your story, where you're going to start writing your story. The back matter is all about the epilogue. It's all about, the author page. If you have other books that you've written or you're involved in other like um I want to say like businesses or nonprofits or research studies, different things like that are pertaining to the book and stuff like that. You can add those in to your author bio section, or you can add them as a whole separate page. So, but that's the back matter of the book. I know. Sounds extremely confusing. Sounds like a lot of work. But when you break it all down, it all basically hinges on what type of book you want to share, what type of book you want to write. If you're writing a bio like me, you don't need a lot of that stuff. You do have to have your copyright page, and you can have a dedication in there, like who this book is dedicated to. You can also have like an introduction or a prologue, and then jump into your story. And then at the end, you can have your author bio page, how they can get a hold of you at the end for more information. Um, and that's about it. You don't have to have a ton. It doesn't have to be complicated. It's your book, it's your story. You get to write it. You just have to decide how you want to write it, what you want to put in it. How do you get started? Well, the quickest way is to start writing. That's the quickest way. A lot of times, I know for me, it depends on how you write. It depends upon your style. It depends upon a few different factors, but you can write out a table of contents. So when I write my table of contents for this book here, I literally, not this book, because that one doesn't have a table. I got to go back and put a table of contents apparently. But this book here, I had a table of contents in it. So when I wrote my table of contents, so I have a dedication in there. I have a few things. Ooh, clearly, I don't know how this works. Oh, anyway, so I have a table of contents in there, and I named all the chapters. And the chapters, the names on it correlate with the story. So as I was writing my table of contents, I actually sat down and I wrote my life outline, where I was at, where I was living, because we moved multiple different places, multiple different times in my childhood. And so I don't have just one spot where I grew up. I don't have one town. I don't have one state. I have, I think by the time I turned 18 or 17 and quit school, I had lived in 18 different states and went to multiple different schools within those states. So I had a lot of moving done. And so I had my mom sit down with me and we created a life outline because I wanted my books to be, I wanted them to be like real. I wanted the timelines to be on. I wanted everything to, I didn't want to lie in my books. Like I abhor lying. I didn't want there to be anything in there that could resemble a lie. Like if I was 9 years old, but in here I said 10 in my book and I was actually 9, I didn't want that. That felt icky to me. So I wanted to make sure that I had my life outline done as exact as I could remember it, as exact as my mom could remember it. And that's how I went. And I'm like, okay, I lived at this place. What story or stories do I have from this place? And then I would start listing them down. And then I would go ahead and I would start writing out those stories. And that's how I wrote the outline for this second book, the Growing Faith book. That's how I wrote the outline, is I just literally sat down, did my life outline, and started writing stories. And that's how I have done it going forward from my first book, is literally sitting down, writing out the memories, having my outline, and just start writing the stories. If you don't know how to type or you don't like to type, it's very simple. We all have Most of us have a smartphone here. Most of us have, access to something like that. You can simply turn it on and hit the record button and then record your story with as much detail as possible, and then you can have it transcribed. There are so many different ways to get that story written. The first and foremost thing you have to do is to start writing it, to start, just to begin. Take pen and paper if you choose, and then have someone else type it out. You can hire a ghostwriter to do all this. So it's not, it is daunting when you're first doing it. I was very daunted to write my first book, but I can absolutely 100% say you can get it done within 30 days if you're committed to it and you're focused on it and you actually sit down and just get it done. Um, but I gotta say, I fell in love with the writing process. I fell in love with the healing that I got even from my childhood and moving all those times. Like you build up all of these things. I want to call them I just want to call them things at this moment because when you move, when you encounter any sort of trauma or negativity in life or whatever, you start building a tolerance to it. And you start hardening yourself. You start changing how you're acting, how you're feeling, how you're doing, how you're being. You start changing all of these things to combat whatever it is that you're facing. Whatever hardship that you're facing, you're like, "Okay, I'm going to I'm going to be tougher at this. I'm going to, be more vocal about this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that." All of these things. And when I started writing down my stories, when I started writing everything down, especially in book 2 and 3 and 4, when I started writing those, I started seeing patterns of ways that I would react to certain situations, to certain people, to certain events, to certain things. And it was fascinating to understand a little bit more about myself and a little bit about more how I react to things and how I process things and how I just do things. And so it's very fascinating how you can learn to understand yourself a whole lot more, which when you're dealing with grief helps with the process just as much. Um, because if you don't know how you do things, if you just blindly do things, then you don't really learn as much from it. But if you start to understand yourself and understand your processes, understand how you work, what makes yourself tick, understand all of these different nuances about yourself, then you can really speed up the healing process, the grieving process, the holy cow, these things are going crazy. Sorry. Um, you can speed this up. So anyway, I hope this got you excited about writing your own book, putting your own story on paper, about putting it into, creating a legacy for your family, creating, a tribute to your loved one. I hope that you do this. It's absolutely an astonishing procedure to go through. It's a transformation to be sure. And not to mention at the end, if you publish it, you actually get to be called an author, like a published author, as opposed to a writer who's still writing their story. You would actually be a published author. So I hope that you guys are learning a ton through this conference. I hope that you're getting tons of notes and you're taking tons of notes and ideas to implement on your grief journey. And yeah, any questions? So I see the Chicken Fox Productions is going to read my book. Yay! That's exciting. Um, I have purposefully not put links up here. I'm not sure why. I know I said purposefully, but I guess I wasn't sure if I was supposed to put a link up here or not. And so if anyone is interested in my links for the books or for getting in contact with me for any of those things, if they can go ahead and email me at faith@faithsage.net, and I will have a link page up for tomorrow nights for people there so they can contact me at that point in time. So if there's no questions, I will go ahead and sign off for the night. I hope that you got a little bit out of wanting to turn your story into a book to help with the grieving process, to help with your family, to do all the things. And I'd love to know. That'd be exciting. So have a great night, and I will see you again tomorrow.